You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hello again, everyone. This is Doug Thorpe, and you're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense. We're the show where we take the whole landscape of leadership, try to break it down into nice, understandable, bite-sized chunks. And today I've got a guest who is a fellow coach, and we share some common bonds out in the marketplace. His name is Ryan Lahti. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Doug. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and Ryan has a specialty in the STEM area. It's a topic that we've talked about a few times on this show, but we will continue the journey and talk about leadership in that world and coaching support that professionals who have that claim, have that title, can get some help and ideas about enhancing their own position and such. But Ryan, I frequently like to start by asking guests, just tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got into what you're doing now.
Sure. In a nutshell, I help executives, board members, and leaders succeed despite uncertainty and risk, especially as you mentioned with STEM organizations. As far as how I went down that path or got on that path to begin with, as long as I can remember, I've always been intrigued by how organizations compete in the marketplace using different strategies, how they're structured, how they create the work environments or cultures that they have. And I'm dating myself a little bit here, but I remember back as an undergrad at UCLA, and this is before the internet was so prevalent, so many, many moons ago, where you actually had to go to a library to kind of do research for classes. I often found myself there that, I'd read an article on something related to the class, but then I'd notice another article is mentioned on leadership or strategy or structure that would take me down a rabbit hole. And 2 hours later, I'd read a bunch of articles that were really interesting to me, but had nothing to do with the class assignment. So it kind of made me realize, okay, that's probably not the best for the class coursework, but it did highlight this is a path, a career path that I would like to go down. And so as I got more and more further into my career, realized, I'm really curious about what helps organizations to operate more effectively. And as I dug into that, I really became more interested in how to help leaders who run those organizations be more effective at what they do, because you and I both know that leadership effectiveness and org effectiveness go hand in hand. So that's kind of what started me down the path. As far as broader career steps, I wanted to get exposure to a variety of different organizations as much as I could in shorter periods of time. So was it a matter of taking a corporate role in leadership and org development? Yes, I did do that, but I also went down the path of large global consulting firms. So that also exposed me, and that was kind of intentional by design, because I wanted to experience both sides of the table. So the service provider as well as the client. And then as far as adding some depth and rigor to my background, grad school was involved there as well. So I could kind of add to the depth in that field.
Sure. So where was the pivot and focus into the STEM world? When did that happen?
That happened several decades ago. And again, I'm dating myself a little bit. But what I realized as I worked with more and more organizations across a variety of industries, that there were certain types that I just found more interesting. And they were typically technical and data-driven, or more specifically driven by science, technology, engineering, and math. So as I started to work with more and more of those organizations, I would find myself in conversations related to STEM. And often when I would talk with people about STEM, I would usually hear two things. The first thing I would hear more often than that was about curriculum or curricula at the middle school, high school, and college level. Like, okay, so those are important for building STEM skills. But the other thing I would often hear, probably a little less often, was about STEM-driven or STEM-related economies, which we all know that STEM-related economies in metropolitan areas do better on jobs and innovation. So as I kept hearing these conversations when I go to conferences or talk with people in different organizations, it just made me realize something or really there was something that was missing. And that is what I consider the linchpin in that continuum from curricula to economies, and that is STEM organizations. So the way I define that is organizations that are technical and data-driven, obviously driven by science, technology, engineering, and math. They are important because they are the linchpin in that continuum that I just described from curriculum to economies. So often when I would share that with people, they would really question, well, are they really that prevalent? Are STEM organizations really that prevalent? And if you think about it, take your typical week or your typical 2 weeks, and you consider what you do, where you go, how you get there, and how you remain able to do all those things, you'll probably find that STEM organizations are involved in all of them. So let me give you some examples here. So you and I are having this conversation using computers, laptops, tablets, software, semiconductors. Those all come from technology companies. How we get to the office buildings, the stores, the houses that we go to. You're probably going to take a car, or maybe you're flying to other parts of the country to visit a client, and you're probably going to fly an airplane. Those come from automotive, aerospace companies. As far as pardon me, where you're going to, the different buildings, etc. Those are built by engineering and construction companies. And then how do you remain able to do all those things? Well, if you wanted to remain healthy, then you bring in hospitals and healthcare organizations, you bring in biotech, med device, pharma companies. As far as, well, how do you replace things that get damaged or that disappear? Well, then you bring in insurance companies. How do you pay your bills? Well, then you bring in banks and financial services. All those are STEM. So STEM organizations impact us much more than we know.
Right. And when I think about the STEM world, I immediately go to my own core passion about leadership development and organizational development. And I'm going to sling a very broad, ugly brush and talk about the personalities that are typically associated with STEM leaders. Mm-hmm. And that is the heavy analytic mindset, the often introverted personality, and boy, there's a joke that just came to mind, and I'm not going to repeat it. It's the engineering joke, and I'm going to let that go. We'll save that for a blog post somewhere. But the point being, often when we think about leading businesses, sometimes we think about the persona that is fairly charismatic, fairly dynamic, a big personality. And you don't see that with STEM people. They tend to be more quiet, reserved, thoughtful, introspective, again, analytical, and somewhat introverted. So when we really focus our attention to how do people build these organizations that no doubt are core based on STEM matters, how do leaders in those organizations create the culture and create the dynamic that generates success?
Well, I'll share some of my experience from the research that I did with STEM organizations. So as I worked with more and more of them across 20 industries, I kept noticing this pattern that kept popping up. And the pattern was this: there were certain leaders that were very good at handling uncertainty and risk. And then there are certain leaders who were not. And these could be technical leaders, these could be overall C-suite leaders, these could be board members as well. As I dug into more and more of that, I'm like, okay, number one, is this a legitimate pattern, or is it just purely coincidence? Number two, if it's a legitimate pattern, what's behind it? So I'm a data guy, so I wanted to kind of dig in and see, okay, let's see if this is what I think it is. As I kind of analyzed the work I'd done across those 20 industries, the pattern was there. But to further validate it in my own mind, I analyzed 10 years worth of leadership assessments that I had done as well. And the pattern was there too. So I'm like, okay, it's a legitimate pattern, but what's behind it? And as I analyzed more of the data, it revealed what I would consider 7 essentials that kind of separated those leaders who are really good at handling uncertainty and risks from those who are not. And so really what I call kind of 7 essentials, and I would break those into 2 categories. One category deals with what these leaders think about on their own prior to and during those situations involving uncertainty and risk, those tricky situations. They're more intrapersonal in nature. They're also foundational because they enable the other 4. The remaining 4 are really more dealing with how those leaders relate to others as they handle the uncertainty and risk. So they are more interpersonal. So if I were to kind of encapsulate or summarize what that represents, it's really the way these leaders carry themselves, as well as understand, process, and skillfully or deftly perform in tricky situations that involve uncertainty and risk. And that's really where I play, is in the uncertainty and risk space. So as I've talked about that with people, they often will say, okay, so what do you mean by these 7 essentials? I'll give you some examples. So to start with kind of the foundational 3, leaders I've found that are really good in STEM organizations at handling uncertainty and risk, the first thing they will typically do is they will take the time to gauge kind of what's the type and severity of the situation, who's in it, who's impacted by it, who can influence it, and how do they do so. That's really more about kind of reading the situation and the stakeholders. The second thing they typically will do is they'll consider, well, okay, what am I bringing into that situation in terms of strengths that can help me with the uncertainty and risk versus the limitations that can possibly get in my way. Then they use those, and that's really about kind of leveraging self-awareness. They then use those 2 in combination to try to identify, well, what are approaches or strategies I can use that are more likely to produce the outcome I'm looking for, typically a positive outcome. And that's really about anticipating the impact. So what I found is the leaders that are really good at handling uncertainty and risk use those 3 just prior to and during the situation they're in. And that enables them to do the remaining 4, which are more interpersonal. I'll give you an example of those as well. So once they're in that situation, how do they show up? Do they use more of a softer, more of a velvet glove approach, or do they use more of a stronger steel hand approach, or something in between those 2? And they determine that based upon the situation they're in and who's in with them. So, and that's really about conveying a measured presence. So they determine how measured to be based upon the situation they're in and who's in with them. Often, what they will find is that there will be conflict. And especially when you're dealing with uncertainty and risk, the conflict will often be more frequent and more intense. So the leaders who are really good at handling uncertainty and risk, when it comes to conflict, they focus more on what the underlying issue is, or figure out what the underlying issue is, rather than focus on the characteristics of the opposition. This person is so X, fill in your favorite, negative adjective, maybe they're obstinate or stubborn, blah, blah, blah. They focus more on the underlying issue. And that's really about differing with the issue, not the party. The next kind of couple things that they would do is, of course, when you're in these tricky situations, you're typically not alone. You're typically not doing it in a vacuum. You will often have people that you're relying on, partnering on to help you be successful, or help these leaders to be successful. What enables that success to continue is these leaders will take the time to help those people understand what's making them successful or not, by providing guidance and feedback to help them continue to be successful. So it's basically what I call being a mirror to help people adjust. And then the last thing that I've seen, that I typically have found that these successful leaders do in uncertainty and risk, is they realize, very quickly realize, if they don't already know, that as much as they may be driven and as much as they may be achievement oriented or results oriented, they cannot do things on their own for very long, or at least not for very long, without risking burnout. So they will take the time to empower others through strategic delegation so that they can spend their time and energy more wisely. In other words, they get things done through others. So that's typically what I found with STEM organizations that help these leaders, whatever form of leader they are. And again, I've defined leadership a little bit more broadly than maybe most people do. That's what helped them to be successful.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
One thing that comes to my mind in my own experience working with STEM organizations, and as most of my audience knows, I live in the Houston area, so I have had opportunity to do some frontline work with a lot of the big oil companies. There's kind of a legacy of leadership and management style that you would classically call command and control. It's a lot of these companies have 100-year legacies, 100-year plus, and they, a lot of the people grew up in the organization working for people that were, my way or the highway kind of programmatic managers. And those coming up adopted that style because that was successful for the old guys, so it's going to be successful for me, and that legacy perpetuates. But I will say this, without any exception, every company that I'm aware of has made a pivot in the last 5 years and said, we have to consciously change that environment. We have to change the culture here. Because the younger generations are not going to suffer that. They're not going to consider us an employer of choice if we continue to operate that way. And B, there's just not a real good reason to do that anymore.
Very, very much so. Absolutely. Especially as the generations kind of succeed the prior generations. I agree with you 100%. What I found when it comes to creating that work environment in the STEM organizations that I've worked with is one thing that really kind of contributes to that is a few elements. The first thing would be, what type of balance is there? And balance in two ways. Number one is the balance that the employees feel between work and personal concerns. For example, let's say that they have an ill or a sick child or spouse or parent. How much flexibility do they have to take care of that ill child, sick parent or spouse? Can they work more remotely and adjust accordingly? Is a company willing to do that? So that's balance in the first sense. The second sense is the balance between purpose and profit. So what is the organization's perspective on that? And what is the individual employee's perspective on that? And how well do those align? More alignment, obviously, the greater the balance and contributes to the better environment. The second thing is, and you kind of hit this already, is, well, where does leadership stand in all this? How well do they coach? How well do they mentor? How well do they recognize people's performance? How well do they actually demonstrate the values that they espouse? Do they just talk about them? Do you actually see them doing them? And the other thing, a few other things that I see that will contribute to that is, well, what are the opportunities that the employees have to apply the capabilities that they've developed over their career or in their jobs at that organization? Do they have the opportunity to maybe take on an informal role as a part of their current job? Do they have an opportunity to do a temporary assignment? Or maybe they have an opportunity to take a new job that will continue to build those capabilities. And as far as like the necessities that the organization provides, well, what type of tools, support, resources? Obviously, comp and benefits is included in that. But what does the organization provide so that they can do their work and sustain themselves? And then the last element is, well, what does growth look like? Growth in the sense of, what are the formal learning and development resources and opportunities or things that they can do to build their capabilities? And that kind of works with what I was talking about a second ago about the job rotational or temporary assignments. They kind of work hand in hand. One is building capabilities. One is more about applying the capabilities and continuing to refine them. So those elements I've found within the STEM organizations that I've worked with really help to kind of build that environment that where people want to be and stay. And we know from research that dating back to the 1960s that when we're looking at what's one of the bigger contributors to that environment, we know that leadership is a big one. 50 to 67% of what people experience in the work environment is due to leadership or the approaches that leaders use. Or if you don't believe Harvard, then listen to Gallup. 70% of the variability engagement across business units is due to leadership. So I think you hit a really good point there about leaders got to adjust, and the smarter organizations are doing that, especially the smarter STEM organizations. So what's the payoff? Well, we know from work that has been demonstrated, again, giving Harvard credit here, not that I'm just want to highlight Harvard, but they happen to do the research, that organizations with those type of cultures where employees feel appreciated, where customers feel appreciated, they have shown over a 4x increase in revenue and a 12x increase in stock price over an 11-year period. So we know that, okay, there's your payoff. It's not just a better environment, it also makes business sense. There's even one tech company that I'm thinking of that actually took it down to the divisional team level. And they found that those organizations that had that more motivating work environment, or pardon me, those teams that had the more motivating work environment brought in $711 million more in profit in a year compared to the teams that didn't have that type of motivating work environment. So I think you hit a really good point there in terms of how important it is to have that type of environment and the roles that leaders play in that.
Well, and at the core of it is this whole idea, and I'll go back to my original broad brush, ugly statement I made, that people with the acumen and the training in the STEM world tend to show up with those unique personalities that are kind of rigid, kind of analytical, generally introverted, et cetera, et cetera. But in the organizations I've worked with, when they've done their employee satisfaction surveys, a couple of very interesting things emerge. There's a statement at all levels, not just the rank and file, but mid-management and upper management. The statement is, I wish my boss was more relatable. And it's interesting to watch these organizations where that's getting reported at every level of the organization. So the senior guys saying, I wish the CEO was more relatable. The L3 is saying, I wish my L2 was more relatable, and so on and so on. And again, those that are really committed to this change have said, all right, what does that mean to become more relatable? And I'll fast forward, I have done a lot of work with some very senior, near retired executives in those companies. And when they look back, they will say, my ability to build relationship was more valuable than any of the technical acumen I ever put on the table. And it was usually a later in career revelation that they needed to work on the relationships around them and above them to really advance and perpetuate success in their role.
I agree with you 100%. And I think the smarter organizations are figuring that out faster. There's one that I'm thinking of on the top of my head that is STEM-based, of course, where 25%, and they say this from the CEO down, actually board level on down, that 25% of your job at this organization is to build relationships. So they not only encourage employees at all levels to do that and have them set aside time in their daily, weekly schedule, but they also have built their campus, and their campus is a large campus, to support that. A lot of open space, a lot of places where people can have one-on-ones or small group chats in order to build those type of relationships. And of course, as you would expect, the culture of this organization is one of the best that I've seen.
Yeah.
And not surprisingly, people very rarely leave. They work hard. No, don't get me wrong. It's not just rainbows and unicorns. They work hard, but they want to be there. And as a result, not surprisingly, this organization is a leader in its industry for the products that it produces. It also has one of the highest amounts of innovation that I've seen in any company. So again, that supports kind of what you're saying here.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I did an engagement last year with a large global tech company that happened to have a big play in the aerospace world. And I was dealing with some upper level leaders, and one of the objectives was to put together a leadership development plan that had 2 or 3 really key initiatives that these people were going to commit to do, and then it had to be reviewed with their bosses. And I took one of my clients and went to his boss's office, and we started doing it. And the boss basically said, I get everything you put on here from a personal level, but you're missing one big one. I want to see you have in your development plan an exercise to figure out how you're going to develop your people. So it was that part relationship, part people-centric, human-centric initiative. And as fate would have it, one of my other coaching clients reported to this same boss. And I, as a coach, I was faced with the conundrum of, do I tip the scales? Do I inform this guy before we get there? And I said, no, I'm going to let him learn it organically. So we scheduled the one-on-one, or the 3-way, I mean, and the boss looked at me and he grinned and he said, you know what I'm going to say, don't you, Doug? And I said, yes, sir, I do. And so he told the guy, he said, personal development looks wonderful, but you've left off an area of developing your own people. And that's my mantra. And so it kind of goes back to what you said, Ryan, about the 25% commitment of effort to, building relationships, developing people, developing teams. And I thought it was interesting to, and when it was over, my second client said, you knew this, didn't you, before you went in there? And I said, yeah, I did, but I thought it'd be more impactful if you heard it from the boss's mouth. So he agreed. He said, that's true.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's more and more, I agree with your point that from the top down or emphasizing that, hence the 25% in that organization I mentioned. There are a couple you made me think of a CEO that I've been working with that was a new CEO that had a similar challenge where he was taking over someone who was kind of had been with the organization. Arguably, he was the founder, taking it for him. So since uncertainty and risk is kind of where I play, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty and risk for this gentleman stepping into a role, replacing someone who had kind of started the organization. This was, a large company, so a fair amount of risk for him, fair amount of risk for the organization as well. And he had challenges that he had faced. He kind of had 2 key ones. One big one was trust. So, and trust with the executive team, largely because of what his predecessor had created. His predecessor had created this environment among the executive team that was very competitive. So basically what the predecessor had done was that when it came to making decisions and from a strategy standpoint and operating the organization, he would make his decision and then he would go ask for input from his executive team. The executive team knew this, of course. And so all they would do is try to figure out which way he was leaning and then try to align themselves with him as best they could. So as a part of doing that, they would often undermine each other, which would just kind of make it that much more of a competitive environment. So that was one kind of element of trust that this new CEO had to deal with. The second thing was that he had a couple players on the executive team, which often happens, which really were not performing at the C-suite level. So the prior CEO knew that, the team knew that, the prior CEO just didn't do anything about it. So the executive team was running, okay, is this new guy just going to continue to do the same thing and let it fester? Or is he actually going to address it? And then the third thing was this gentleman actually had been one of their peers. Now he was their boss. So now they're trying to deal with him in that respect. So you had those dynamics to deal with. So when he approached me and we were talking about it, well, how do you want to proceed? And I said, well, you've got a huge trust problem here. So you've got to start there. Otherwise, the relationships aren't going to continue to develop the way they should develop. And you can't grow this organization. You want it the way you want it to grow without your executive team helping you make that happen. And so that's kind of where we started. And then second element for him was really about managing conflict. So bright guy, very talented guy, but when it came to disagreement, he would often dig in his heels, and it became this contentious test of wills. So it was a matter of trying to get him to understand, okay, conflict isn't a bad thing. It's just, it needs to be productive conflict. And basically, if you look at what it is, it's just a difference in perspective between two or more parties. And so you got to make your peace with that. How you handle it makes it good or bad. So if you can focus less on the person sitting across the table and what you think of them, or their whatever adjective you want to apply to their names, and more on the underlying issue that is really important to them or to the rest of the team, you're going to have a better outcome. And eventually we got there. But to your point, it does take some willingness to be a part of it, and the recognition that this needs to be a part of that individual's plan as well.
Another theme that I've heard a lot coming out of STEM organizations is that, and part of this goes to your whole uncertainty factor, as market dynamics are shifting rapidly and technologies are changing rapidly, et cetera, companies are faced with assessing new situations and new opportunities. And again, going back a little bit to the command and control style of leadership, there's a tradition of sort of working the problem and getting 100% accuracy of and contributing to the answer before you make a decision. Mm-hmm. And the report out is that it's a classic Peralta rule. 80% of the answer takes a minute to figure out, but that last 20% of certainty takes a long time to research, analyze, and assess. And if you wait for that 100% certainty, you miss the opportunity. Mm. So there's a mind shift of saying, well, is a 70, 80% solution satisfactory? If the 70 or 80% certainty tells us go, then let's go. And let's get our minds around becoming comfortable with accepting the outcome. If our 70 or 80% said all green light, let's go, and we go, and whatever reason turns out it's a fail, we need to become okay with accepting that, because business is risky. Mm-hmm. And so that's a conundrum in the STEM mindset that is a big challenge as I've seen it. What have you seen in that regard for decision making?
Well, I do see the same thing, and it's great if you have enough lead time. It really is. But whether you're talking from a strategy standpoint at the enterprise level, if you're just talking about walking into a board meeting, it's great if you can prepare for that and if you know what to expect. But often you don't have that information, so a lot of it you have to do more in real time. So to the point, and I'm taking down the individual level now, and I'll go back to the broader points you're making at the individual level, because I will get this question a lot from clients, whether they're a board member or a C-suite executive or a division head. It's like you can, plan if you know who's going to be there, what the call is going to be about, the meeting's going to be about. But if you don't have that luxury, and many times you don't, you've got to pay attention to what's going on in the room, what's the information you have in front of you, and especially the data in the room to help you make that decision. And you make the call as best you can. You don't want to get stuck in analysis paralysis, which, that 80, 90% can be good enough, and the 10% doesn't gain you that much. Even if you can get it, to your point, it takes much more time, and the ROI may not be there. So it often will end up being iterative. And even if you look at the organizations in the STEM space, and a lot of them are highly dependent upon innovation, the innovation they have, they aren't always 100% sure that it's going to be perfect when they put out a new product, a new service.
Right.
It's iterative.
Right. I think about, recent headline news, all the work that is going on at SpaceX and how many launches have blown up on the launch pad. And, those guys worked the problem and had what they believed was 100% certainty of success. And then they lit the candle and poof, big flame out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm thinking just if we're looking at just on the concept of innovation, thinking about, something that we all use every day, which is most all of us anyway, a smartphone. So what were the mobile phones they had 20 years ago? The size, the power they had, what you could do with them compared to what we have now, just the amount of innovation that went into that and the iterative innovation that went into that, from not only just the size and power of the chips inside of them, the durability of the case that housed those components, the screen, the touch screen that we now have, which 20 years ago, you have a what on your phone? And then, all the things that we can do with the operating system and the apps that come in, whether it's ordering, food or an Uber or groceries, that alone, just the innovation is mind-boggling, but that didn't happen perfectly the first time.
Right. Right.
And I'll share another example with you that was more recent. Just looking at another section of STEM, where you look at, well, what about something like an artificial heart valve or a bioprosthetic heart valve? The amount of innovation that went into that, wasn't perfect the first time. And I'm not talking about just the cobalt chromium alloy structure that the bovine or porcine tissue is attached to in terms of innovation. I'm talking about what amount of innovation went into the bovine tissue itself. Where do you source it? How do you store it? How do you ship it? How do you prevent it from calcifying, which is a common issue for any hard tissue, whether it's human or animal. That, again, we wish we could walk into that and have the 100% answer. Probably not.
Right.
First go round.
Right. Well, and that's obviously where research and discovery comes into play. And, I'm thinking about the famous mindset at Amazon for, fail fast and let's fail forward. And so it was that whole idea of, got an idea, let's go try it and see what it does. And if it doesn't work, okay, let's learn from it and keep moving. And I think that's the mindset shift that often betrays your classic STEM leader. They're wanting process, they're wanting levels of certainty, levels of measure, and levels of data input to be able to make those ultimate decisions and go and no go. And in the velocity of business today, you don't always have that.
You don't have the luxury, and you make a really good point there, because I was actually just talking with a client earlier this week who actually is heads up their R&D division of an organization, and he has a challenge when he brings in people with a heavy technical background that often will come out of academic arena or even more technical space than that, and trying to get them to make that transition from, okay, this is not research just for research's sake. It's also, you need to be able to do something with this and do something with this within a fixed time frame. So yes, and it reinforces that point we were talking about a few minutes ago about 90%, and then we try it, and then we iterate, and then we go from there, versus the traditional academic model is, no, it has to be near perfect before we'll do anything. Two different mindsets, two different arenas. One is more applied and one is more for research sake.
Well, one last topic area I want to get into, Ryan, and then we're going to have to wrap this up.
Sure.
The evolution of business relative to the COVID lockdown and the whole work from home environment, what are you seeing with the companies you work with and their struggle to make the call about return to work?
I'm seeing more and more them starting to stabilize, to be quite honest with you. A year ago, if you asked me that question, I would see a lot more churn, a lot more frustration, and what do we do? I'm not seeing that anymore. I'm seeing much more organizations, this is what our hybrid policy is. And again, it's much more hybrid in terms of forcing them back to work 100%. It's more hybrid. And the hybrid most commonly I'm seeing is 3 days in office, 2 days off. And then some variability in terms of you pick the days, but they've got to be consistent, whatever you decide on.
Yeah. I would have to agree. And I like the way you frame that. I think it has generally stabilized more so than it was probably a year ago. I think there's still a somewhat raging debate by some, and I was reading some articles this morning before I opened up my day, and the commentaries were the fact that the jury is still out. We're not done yet. finding the answer to this question. But I think everybody is agreeing that work will never look the same again as it was pre-COVID, that the 40 hours in the office for those who do office work is not going to happen. So there'll be some iteration, some variety, some change. But, a lot of the leaders I talk with, it clearly has been a struggle for them to embrace leadership in the electronic world, and I have opted to challenge most of my clients to quit using it as a convenient excuse.
Yeah, agreed.
And step up and think about how you can better lead your team, even though they all might be on a screen. And there are still ways you can connect and influence and have that relationship with your people, even though you don't see them 5 days a week in the office.
I agree with that 100%. The one other thing that I would add to that is, again, I think it's a matter of perspective, and that's why I agree with you saying, calling them out on, okay, you're using that as an excuse is actually can be a huge advantage. And many of the executives that I've found are more effective have looked at it just that way. And many of them have said, I'm able to connect with more people in other parts of the country or other parts of the world if they have, staff, a large amount of staff in India or some other place as well. I didn't get to interact with them that much. So by the fact that we're using Zoom or Teams or Google Meets or RingCentral, whatever your preferred application, I can connect with them much more and I have a much better rapport with them. Now, if we want to complain to say, well, we're not in the same physical space, well, then you do something about that. But the Zoom piece or the virtual piece, I think, can be a huge advantage. So I'm kind of with you. It's a matter of how you look at it and how you decide to use it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ryan, for sitting in and sharing with us. Tell folks the best way to get a hold of you if they're looking for more information.
Probably the best way to get hold of me would be, reach out to me on LinkedIn, look up Ryan Lahti, send me a meeting invite, or go to orgleader.com. You can find out more information there.
All right. And as always, folks, we're going to have that information in the show notes. And I want to close by thanking you for your time. I know you're busy out there trying to make a difference where you are. And I do not take for granted your participation as a listener, and I would welcome your feedback and input. Drop me a line on any of my social links. Let me know what you're thinking. If there's a topic we haven't covered yet that you'd like to hear, let me know. And with that, I'm going to sign off, say goodbye, have a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.